Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you're here today to talk about reading and why what we read matters to our children and matters to God. What we read to our children matters. So we want to begin by introducing ourselves. I am Betsy Childs Howard. I am a mother of two little boys, and I live in New York. And I work part-time for the Gospel Coalition as an editor. And I also oversee the line of kids books that we've started called TGC Kids, and have written 2 children's books. I'll say what they are too, because I'm going to have the rest of you say that. So Arlo and the Great Big Cover-Up was the first one, and then Polly and the Screen Time Overload just came out a couple months ago. So I love children's books. I loved reading when I was a child. I love learning about children's books, and I'm looking forward to asking these women more questions about how they, as parents, all their children are older than mine, how they chose books, read books to their children, and inspired a love of God through what they read. So would you each tell us your name, how old your children are, and any children's books you've written? Megan?
So my name is Megan Hill. I'm the managing editor at the Gospel Coalition. I have 4 children. I have 3 boys who are 15, 14, and 13, and then I have a 5-year-old little girl. And I have a children's book called Meg is Not Alone that will be coming out in February of this year, or of next year.
Hi, I'm Trillia Newbell, and I'm the acquisitions director at Moody Publishers, and I have a 15, almost 16-year-old, and then a 12-year-old girl, so boy-girl, and they are delightful. I have written a couple of books. So my kids' book, God's Very Good Idea, and then The Big Wide Welcome. And then, so those are for younger age, they're picture books. And then I've written a middle grade kind of chapter book called Creative God, Colorful Us. And then I have another one coming out next year, and I can't remember the name. On friendship with Crossway. And that is amazing. And then, so I'll have 2 books with Crossway coming out in the future. So look for them, and you can tell me the titles.
I am Irene's son, and I am from Pittsburgh. I have 4 boys. They are 14, 12, 9, and 4. I got through that part. I've written 2 children's books. The first one is God Counts, Numbers in His Word and His World. And the second one, yep, that's going to happen. The second one is Taste and See, all about God's goodness. And this is one of 3 copies that are in the United States right now, because the rest are coming in from Egypt because they are lost in the wilderness of the Atlantic Ocean, just like the Israelites.
Well, let's start by telling me, is there a book that you remember that had a really formative impact on you as a child? It doesn't have to be a spiritually formative, but was there a book that made a huge impression? Megan?
So I remember a book, I still have it. It was called The Summer Folk, and the illustrations in the book were just black and white pen drawings, and it was about a little boy who went off on this adventure into the swamp in his boat. And as he goes along on the adventure, he just meets these different people, and he has meals with them, and he gets to know them. And to me, it was pen and ink drawings, and so it wasn't it was interesting visually, but it was not colorful. But the imaginative world of this boy going off in his boat in the swamp and meeting these people was just so captivating to me. And I read that book over and over and over again.
So great. So interestingly enough, I was not at home reading books. I was playing in dirt. So I don't have one as a young kid that I can even remember. I just don't recall reading a ton, and I don't recall being read to. It just wasn't a part of our culture, our family culture, not my culture, but the family culture. And so I remember books that I read in high school, because I did begin to develop a love for literature, but I didn't become a Christian until the age of 22. So the things that I remember are things like The Count of Monte Cristo and Edgar Allan Poe, and I really love The Great Gatsby. So I was into those classics, but not so much Jesus. and as a kid, I wasn't exposed. Yeah.
So I grew up in Malaysia, where a child's life is dictated by the exams they're going to take. So I too did not read. I was not playing in dirt, but I was doing other very boring things, not as fun as playing in dirt. But I did remember a book that my mom was reading that I picked up, and it's this book. I tracked it down on the internet, and there was a small Chinese Christian bookstore in California that found this first edition in their inventory from 1981. And so the moment it came in the mail, it was shocking to me, because the moment I held the book, the weight of it, the texture of the pages, the look of the inside, I just started weeping uncontrollably, because this is one of the only Christian books I read in my perhaps teenage years.
And what's the book about?
So this is called The Call of a Child, 同心的呼唤, and it's about a little boy whose father was very, very antagonistic towards the church. But he was invited by a little girl to her church, and he became a Christian, but later was beaten by his dad for being a Christian. And so I just found that so compelling, because I had never read a story in a book about Christian children.
I can see why that made an impression. The one that came to mind to me, much lower level read, I read very early. It was all black and white and yellow, and it was called Finona the Beautiful. It's not a very common book, I don't know where we got it, but the whole message, it was about a girl that was the most beautiful. She had the best of everything and the most of everything, and she wasn't very happy. And she looked around and saw these people that were not very beautiful, that were very happy and friendly, and she sort of learns that that's not necessarily what makes you happy. And that made a huge impact on me as like a 5 or 6 year old, to recognize that having the most of everything, in fact, it could kind of distance you from people sometimes. So I was really grateful that not a Christian book at all, but one that made an impact on me. Let's talk a little bit about the messages our children get through what they read or have read to them. For you as a parent, how does being a Christian change the way you approach reading with your kids? Irene, do you want to start?
Yeah, I gave this some thought, because non-Christian feels like books are a very good thing to have around the house. Like, so what is the difference then for a Christian parent or just a Christian reader from a non-Christian reader? Because they too are book lovers, and they too are word lovers. And as I was praying and thinking about this, I think what it comes down to is that because the Bible is a book, and our Lord Jesus Christ is the Word. And so we have a very different telos, a very different destination from a non-Christian reader. When we read books to our children, there's a goal of desiring to enjoy and glorify God forever. We read in communion with Christ, and we read with the light of Christ. And I think that is the distinction between a Christian reader and a non-Christian reader.
That's good. I feel just a great call to go and make disciples of all nations. And so for me, my children are my first disciples. They're the people that I'm going to be discipling, that is. And so when I'm thinking about what I'm reading or what they're reading, because they're older now, what they're ingesting, it's really important to me that they understand that what they ingest will affect them, and it will affect their worldview. So how they view the Lord, how they view people. So it's essential to me that they are equipped. And I allow my kids to read pretty broadly. So one of the things that I'm trying to help them understand is to think critically, not as a critic, but critically, so that when they're reading, they can discern, okay, what is good, what is right, because ultimately we've been reading in the Bible. And so for us, that's one of the things that's just really important to me, is that I'm discipling them and teaching them all that God has commanded them, and that as they're reading, that they understand how words have like great power. and so it's important to me that they are guarded, but also exposed so that they can think critically in the world and discern what is good. So it's a discipleship for me. We have fun, but everything to me is about discipleship.
Yeah, I think along with that, I think you're so right, Trillia. You know, I have 3 teenage boys, and if I sat down with them and said, tell me what you're thinking, tell me what's going on, you know, they would look at me like, what on earth, right? But when we read something, then we have something to talk about. And then that's when those things come out. So it's an opportunity, whether it's reading the Bible in family worship, then we have something to discuss, or whether it's listening to an audiobook, then we have something to talk about. And it's just an opportunity for those things to be discussed.
No, that's so good. So I have 2 children, and they're very different. My daughter would need to read to talk. My son just talks. So when she said that, I was like,
yeah, okay. So it's not a gender thing, it's just my kid.
Yeah. My son, but it's interesting, I'm so glad you say that. Most of the things he's talking about are things he's read. So she's exactly right. Most of the things he's talking about is what he's learning. So what he ingests is so important because it sticks with them. It sticks so much. And right now he's into, so I have older kids. He's into philosophy. And so I'm like, you know what we're going to read together? Mere Christianity. So just so that we can I'm discipling. But anyways, it's absolutely right.
I think another metaphor for discipleship is a shepherd. And so we're shepherding these sheep because I still need shepherding from my good shepherd. So I think that's the comforting for moms. And those of you who are moms of young children, just be comforted that the good shepherd is shepherding us even as we are shepherding our children.
And I think what you've talked about kind of gets at something, which is because we are hoping to disciple our children, we talk about what they read, and we talk about what we read to them. So we're not just putting it out there. It's not just staying in their room or in their backpack or in their classroom. We want to process that with them. We want to talk about what's good, what's true, what's not true, what catches their imagination. So it's a joy to have those conversations. So that's what we want to do as Christian parents or teachers or grandparents. But what are a lot of the popular messages coming through most of the kids' books at Barnes & Noble or your, just large secular bookstore? What kind of messages do you hear?
You can be whatever you want to be.
Which is not true. In what ways? So there's the generic sort of you can be a fireman, you can be the president, but then there's also what other ways is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's just like a lot of like, you are a creative person, so you be creative, or don't let anyone tell you that you can't do this, whatever, even for little kids, that you can't do this thing, you can go out there and do it,
Well, also with gender and sexuality.
Right, yeah.
And so I know that my daughter, she's 11, about to be 12, and so we were talking about puberty and all of those things. And as I hunted for things that I can show her, I realized, I can't show you any of these. I can talk to you about them because you need to know, but I'm not going to hand it to you to read. And so I had to develop my own mini curriculum for my daughter so that I could teach her about her body and about what's going on in her body. And because right now everything's a choice. everything's a choice. And so I wanted her to know and to be equipped. And she is exposed to lots of things. And so we're not like blinders on. We're teaching and helping them to understand and helping them understand their neighbor who thinks differently than them. But when it's about equipping them and discipling them and what they're going to read and ingest, we want them to know truth. And so, sorry, I went beyond the question.
No, that's very true. And you know what you say about gender and sexuality, that's not just in the books on puberty for teens. It's in the youngest picture books before they're thinking about these things. I mean, I've seen multiple books about the prince who married the prince who found the knight, teaching a message, like trying to sort of change the male-female romance story. Or at my talk the last time we had a women's conference, I read a book called Red, a crayon story. It's just about crayons, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about a red crayon that's not really red. He just has a red paper, but on the inside he's blue. And it's just a thinly veiled parable of gender confusion. So it's amazing to me how many messages are being pushed through secular books. People think of Christians as the ones who are going to be preachy, but secular publishers take happy little stories and put a lot of preaching in them.
Well, I mean, everything really is about teaching. It's so funny. I don't want to dominate, but I do really feel convictionally that we are being disciples. So you're either going to be the one who's discipling or the culture is, and you've got to make a choice. And so it's something that's just a deep conviction, and it's because books teach, books equip, books inspire, books help you know that you can be creative and you can do all things. So books are so powerful and important, and so yeah.
It's so realizing there's a lot of false messages out there. What do you do, particularly if you're like reading to a younger child, or maybe you're reading a book along with your teen or they're telling you about it, and you come to something that either subtly or overtly contradicts biblical values? Do you slam it shut? How do you talk about that with them?
I think we talk about it with them. And I think it really depends on the age of your child, because there are so part of discipleship is we need to know our child. And a book that is good to read for one child, for example, perhaps a girl, one thing we haven't talked about is violence. So a girl would be reading a book about fighting and violence, and she may not be tempted to be violent towards her brother or sister. But a boy who is reading a book about violence would be very inspired, because I have boys. and I know about being inspired by violence.
I feel like my daughter is probably inspired by violence as well.
So I think knowing your child is so important, because there's a difference between saying yes to a book, no to a book, and some books we would say wait. So it's not wrong for you to read this book. It's just that it's like a knife. It's a very sharp book, and you don't know how to handle knives right now. And so we're going to cut with plastic knives, perhaps, and learn how to use a plastic knife before we go to the steel sharp blades. And so or we can talk about food. Like some children are allergic. My son was allergic to gluten for a very long time, and he's still allergic to peanuts. And then some children are not. So we need to distinguish and discern, is this poison or is this junk food? Or is this vegetable or is this meat? There's just so many layers of discernment and complexity and prayer that goes into discipleship.
And I'm sure a lot depends on the age of your children, how much you articulate that. Whether it's like, no, that book's not for you, or that book's not for you, and here's what I see about it. That, as they get older, I think more and more you can have that conversation probably.
Well, and my kids are in public school, so they're assigned books. And so we just need to be ahead of it. And so we're looking at their curriculum and looking what they're reading, and there's just absolutely no way that we can or have read every single thing that they've read, but we are so open and we try to have so many conversations that they can come to us and ask us questions, and we are already talking about some of the cultural things that they're probably going to see in these books, whether it's violence or sex or, well, that's about it. Or cuss words or whatever. And so we're already having those conversations, which I think is really important, is if you're get ahead of it at an age appropriate stage. That's helped us so that we've talked about it, and it's not a surprise to well, sometimes it is, but it's not a massive surprise because we've been having these conversations as a family.
Why are kids' books so effective at changing the way kids think?
Well, I mean, especially if it's a story, right? It draws you in.
Yeah, let's say fiction.
Yeah. I mean, it draws you in to an alternate world, and especially for young children and even for teenagers, especially in fiction, you're not aware always that it's didactic, and you're not aware, and so you just sort of accept it as a story, right? Whereas my children, if somebody came up to them and said, well, you can choose whatever gender you want to be, my kids would be like, no, that's wrong. But if it's a story and it's a character that they've kind of come to like and respect, and something happens, they're not always aware.
That's really good.
That's really true. And it engages your imagination and your emotions, and some of those things make the logical part less prominent. Because, like you said, they don't think they're evaluating an argument. They're just feeling what the character is feeling.
Well, I was just going to say, think about how we're affected by things. Think about if you're watching a show, or, I remember once I watched some romantic comedy, and then I got done, and I was like, I hate my husband. He doesn't do any of that. What an idiot. I mean, how terrible is that? And I don't feel that way, obviously. But that's how it can affect us. And so if we who are sanctified and being sanctified can be affected that deeply, think about our children. They're being shaped. And so I just love that, what you said, Megan.
And that's not just shaped for ill. They can shape them for good. There's many, like the Chronicles of Narnia are probably the very best example of something that can engage their hearts. They don't realize they're being taught, but their worldview is being formed. Someone said that everything C.S. Lewis believed about everything was in everything he ever wrote. I don't know if that makes sense, but like all of his worldview about God and creation, that's all in the Chronicles of Narnia. And if you read his other books, you start to see, oh, this is what he was doing with that character. So how do we balance exposing our kids to good messages with also seeing story time as something we simply want them to enjoy? Like, do you let your kids read the literary equivalent of junk food if they want to? Megan?
So when I was a child, my mom had a list, and so first of all, I should say that when my mom grew up, reading was not encouraged in her home. It was not seen as a valuable use of time. And so when she had her own children, she thought, I'm going to make reading important. So I really appreciate her making that effort. And we were at the library, every time it was open, all that. But anyway, my mom had a list of books that she wanted us to read, whether it was classics or ones that she thought had a good message. And her rule was always, you read one book from my list, then you can pick one book. And the ones that we picked, it was within... she would vet those too sometimes, but and that's something that I've continued with my own kids. Here's a list of things I want you to read. If you read one of those, then you can pick one, and that's just been really helpful to have kind of that balance. Like, yes, there are certain things, but then there's also, you can explore and you can find out new genres that you might not have thought of, or new stories you might not have known about. And
good messages are usually the ones that are enjoyable. So I think of them in 3 different categories. There's beauty, goodness, and truth. And so the ones with good messages, we think, oh, this book has a lot of goodness and truth in it. And the ones that are really compelling are high on the beauty scale. And we want all three to be present on the list that your mom has. Like, so when we choose books for our children, when I'm reading aloud something with my children every morning, I would want to choose one that is good, beautiful, and truthful, because I just don't have a lot of time with them. And if we're going to read something out loud and walk through all the characters and the plot and enjoying them together, I want it to be a good feast. And if it's, because when it's beautiful, then goodness and truth becomes compelling. But if it's very trite and flat and boring, then we're making goodness and truth very trite and flat and boring, and I never want that. And so we want all three elements in a good story.
I'm going to get real practical. So practically what we would do is just say yes. So if our kids wanted to read with us and it was a good and beautiful and book, then we would say yes, we would read. That to me is actually the hardest time about story time, because it's usually when they were younger.
To read to them.
To read to them. So practically we would make that effort, because I think we're busy and tired and it's just very difficult. You want to go to bed or you want your time. And so we would read with inflection and joy and make it fun, because it's hard. It's hard. It's an effort. It's it really is a sacrifice at times to read to your children. And so that's one way that you take beautiful books and enjoy them with your child and make it, you enjoy it with them and let them see that it's beautiful and good and it's so enjoyable. And so that's one practical way that we did it.
And it's interesting, the cover of a book is very attractive to children. There's a reason that they say you can't judge a book by its cover, But as children are getting older, reading on their own rather than us reading to them, one thing that is helpful, my mom used to do it with us. If there was something that didn't look very appealing, didn't sound very appealing, but she knew we were going to love it, she would say, depending on the length, depending on our age, just read 10 pages of it and see, or just read 50 pages of it if it was a longer book, read 5, and that was usually long enough for your imagination to get hooked and to realize there is more to this book than I could tell by the title.
That's good.
Well, this answer I'm sure is different depending on which stage of parenting and which age of your children you're talking about, but when do you typically read to your kids? So Trillia, you read to them when you were very tired, and that's very sacrificial. But
well, yeah, when they were little, I would read with them at night, because that just seemed like the logical.
Before bed.
Yeah, before bed, bedtime reading. And I was at home, so we would also read throughout the day, but that nighttime reading was when we read. Does that make sense? Like, we read whenever, but nighttime for sure. Now, I have the joy of one child, we don't read books. I'm going through the parables of Jesus with her. So we're doing a Bible study, but I'm leading it. So I do that with my daughter. She's not really into books. And so I've found different ways to disciple her and to help her. She wants to play with mud like me. She's like me when I was a kid. And so I'm doing other things with her. My son, we're reading a book. We're reading Mere Christianity together. And so we're discussing and reading, and that's the way that I am discipling and engaging with them. And then, of course, they're doing whatever they do, and we talk about what they're learning, but that's what we do.
When you say you're reading it together, are you reading it out loud, or are you each reading it and then coming together?
No, that would be hilarious to read out loud, or with my 15-year-old. But so on Monday nights, we read together and then talk, or together, but not together, and then talk about it. So we're reading at the same time, or we'll read and then call each other, or so it depends on what it is. But it's not I'm reading to him. He would be so annoyed because he's 15, almost 16. But yeah, it's a joy. It's just a joy to get to engage our kids and minds in various ways, and the ways they're so different. And so that's how my kids are different.
Irene, when do you read to your kids?
So I am a homeschool mom. So I chose being a homeschool mom largely because I love reading to my children. And it started out, sorry, this is going to be a long story, but it started out when I gave birth to my fourth child. And my postpartum darkness was very, very deep and wide. And I could not go out of the house. It was very painful. Like sunlight was too bright for me. That was kind of how my darkness went. And so I couldn't bring my kids to the zoo or outside or anywhere. So I stayed inside, not because of COVID, just because, and this was pre-COVID. And so reading together, reading books together became the way we went outside. And that was my year of weakness, and the Lord really multiplied my weakness. He caused an abundance to grow. We read so many books out loud together because that was the only way I could give myself to my children. And so now I'm no longer postpartumly depressed, but we choose to read in the morning. So I have a 4-year-old usually climbing all over me while I'm reading to the 3 older ones, and then I would read a picture book to the 4-year-old.
Megan, do you have?
So we do something similar to what Trillia does. We have a book that's going with the teenagers, and we do it by the week. So like read this chapter this week. We did John Owen's Glory of Christ. Now we're doing Rebecca McLaughlin's 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer about Christianity. And it's, we just are assigned it. Everybody independently reads the chapter, and then we come together and discuss it, usually Monday nights during family worship, then we discuss it. We also do a lot of audiobooks. So with 4 children, mine are not homeschooled, so we spend a lot of time in the car. And so we have audiobooks going, and we all listen.
That's a great idea. Stealing the idea. Audiobooks.
You may
great.
have it. Thank you.
And are those fiction or all different kinds of, what sort of audiobooks?
We listen to fiction. We usually try to find a book that my husband and I enjoy, but that's also clean for the children. So like we do, recently we've done some of Alexander McCall Smith's, like Number One Ladies Detective Agency. And also we try to pick something that doesn't have, that you can pop in and out of, so if you don't listen to it for a few days, you haven't forgotten the whole, we're not doing Dostoevsky by audiobook in the car,
Do you sneak and listen after they get out of the car?
I confess to having done that before and then quick rewind it back to what they were on. Yes, I do confess that.
Well, we talked a little bit about it's important to know your child. Irene was saying, is violence going to tempt them, that kind of thing. How do you evaluate whether a book might be too scary, sad, or mature for your child? And along with that is, do you read it before they read it? I'm thinking chapter books now, that kind of thing. How do you know what they can handle, especially if you haven't read it? Or do you read it? Megan?
Okay.
Or Julia? Yeah.
Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. I do not read every book that my children read because a lot of them, as I kind of mentioned this earlier, they're assigned. Unless they're at home. I mean, I read the ones that I assign, but I haven't read every book that they've read. But we're in conversation. So that's really, my kids seem tempted in different ways. And so I haven't found that by what they read, it has affected what it's mostly the general environment, their friends might, and so we're a little bit more aware of, okay, who are you around, who are you talking to, how is that going to influence you, and less about what books, just because we're just in so much conversation. And I guess I would say, and I haven't even thought about it until I've just started talking about it, God has just been kind, I guess, to help Thurn, my husband, and I very early on to establish not an open conversation and a heart for discipleship, and to be teaching them already. So I believe that's just been God's kindness and grace, because it's not something that I would have realized until this panel. I'm like, oh, okay, that's helpful. But but I don't reread or read before that they,
I think this is where it might serve all of us just to say this out loud, even if we already know it. Aside from the Bible, there are no perfect books. Even our beloved C.S. Lewis has elements in his books that are just not right. So, for example, I'll give a concrete example. When he describes the enemies of Narnia, they have dark skin, they eat garlic. I was like, wait, that sounds a lot like people from Malaysia. And so there is no book that is perfect. And we need to stop as moms to chase after that perfect resource. And so this is why I'm learning from these moms of older children, because they keep emphasizing the word conversation and start early to have these discussions, because our destination is to be able to talk about the Bible and to talk about God and to be in communion with Christ and to read everything in light of Christ. But if we don't have this culture of talking about books at home, and it doesn't have to be, how does this book make you feel? I mean, no, like just, it can be interesting, like, I wish that ending was different. And I really didn't like it when that person said that because... And so it can just be a conversation, because on the day when Christ resurrected from the dead, he could have done anything. He could have done anything, really. But he went to two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he talked to them about books in the Old Testament. And that is a conversation. And he brought light to their eyes, and their eyes were open, and their hearts burned with truth and goodness and beauty.
I think along with that, too, you just pray. We come, our family, we come home from the library, and everybody has, a stack of 15 books. And so we've had these conversations, and I say to them, I don't know about all these books, so if one of them is inappropriate, please don't read it. And then you just pray. And I have my kids come back to me and go, hey, I got halfway through this book, and it is not good. And can you please take it back to the library? Well, thank you, Lord. Some of it has got to be the Spirit just working in them for them to have discernment.
And the only way, I'm so sorry, but the only way you can do that is if you trust the Lord. Like, trust the Lord, which is, we're entrusting their lives to Him. And that, I bet that also expresses to your kids that you trust them. Yeah. And which is...
You guys know what's right.
Yeah, so. It goes a long way, and that's just really encouraging.
And going along with what Irene was saying about no perfect books, you might have a book that's totally clean, no bad words, no sex, no violence, but they may read it and you may start to see it affect their attitude. It may be the way the characters talk about their parents, the way they think about life. Just, there's some books, particularly in that middle grade area, that are just depressing. Or, they're trying to articulate the way a teenager feels, but there are some things that it's not helpful to articulate. Like, sometimes I've had emotions that I thought, once I put my finger on it, it just makes it that much worse. Now, there's times it's good to articulate as well, but I think it's wise to watch your kids and what they read, and if you see something affecting them, talk about that, why that might be affecting, what in there, that even though there's nothing dirty, what are the attitudes, and are those attitudes they want to have themselves? Well, we're close to being finished, but I would love to know, what are some good sources for identifying good books for kids? How did you make your list? You talk about this list that you have of books you want your kids to read. How did you do that?
So on the Gospel Coalition blog, Justin Taylor, I think, has a list of recommended reading books, so I use that. World Magazine.
And let me just say, if you just Google classical Christian reading list, it will come up, and it's by age and grade, and it's a really good list.
Yep, so I use that. World Magazine also has lists of recommended books for different ages and grades, and I trust them as a trusted resource. So
is that on the web, or is that just something you've...
I'm not sure. I think it is on the web, yep. And then I have English teachers in my church who have been super helpful to me as well. So I have my one son who is 13 is he's just a super advanced reader. He is reading Dostoevsky this summer, and I just need some help, right? Yeah. And so I have some English teachers in my congregation where I'm like, okay, what can he read that's at his level but is not going to do damage to his soul?
What they said, but also I'm going to twist it a little and say I read. And so I'm not going to, for the little kids, it's a little different, right? When they were younger, you're talking to friends and those recommendations or looking at Christian bookstores. But for this age where I'm giving them, especially when if I'm talking about Christian books, right? Not your everyday classics, but Christian books. I'm reading them so that I can suggest them. And so I would suggest that when possible, listening to audiobooks, reading as much as you can so that you can equip your kids and encourage them to do likewise.
So a couple of resources is the Read Aloud Family by Sarah Mackenzie. And she also has a podcast and she has blogs online. So I've been helped tremendously by Sarah Mackenzie, Read Aloud Family. And another one that I recently discovered is Matali Perkins. She is an immigrant from India, I believe. And she wrote a book called Steeped in Stories. And she writes about 7 classics, like Heidi and even one of the Chronicles of Narnia. And then she models for us how to see the flaws and seek the virtues. And so she calls like Lewis Uncle Jack. So the premise is that none of these books are perfect, but how do we seek virtue in each of these books? And she also talks about the virtue of reading many stories, because it is dangerous to just have one worldview. And so Matali, not being originally from America, gave me that perspective and helped me see the value in having a different non-Western perspective. And so she says that danger with stereotype, it's not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. And so she is all for many stories and not banning books.
I also recommend Honey for a Child's Heart by Gladys Hunt. That she has, the beginning of the book is about the sort of things we've been talking about, and then the end of the book is book lists, all kinds of different books, not all Christian books, but books that are great for Christian families. And then also there's one called Books Children Love. There's updated editions of that, and that has similar kind of book lists by age. So right as we're closing, I would love for each of you to tell me what's a book that you and your kids have really enjoyed, of any variety, genre, age. I'll say right now we're reading a lot of Richard Scarry. It's just, it kills a lot of time going through looking at those detailed pictures and learning about the world. Although I did notice in Busytown, there's no church in Busytown. We haven't talked about that yet. My son is not quite old enough to discuss that, but that's someday we will.
This is hard to choose.
I know, it's very hard. Just
That's why
doesn't
they're
have to be
making
the
me
top.
go first. I think one that I often recommend is the book Sweep by Jonathan Auxier. Sweep. And it's great. And recently we read Glitch, and I don't remember the name of the author, but it's about time traveling. So if you have...
Are those chapter books?
They're chapter books, yes. And so these are books that I walked at 3 miles an hour with them because we read them out loud.
We love the audiobook of Charlotte's Web, read by E.B. White. He has the great Maine accent, and that's like the first audiobook that my kids, started with when they first were able to digest an audiobook of a really long length, and it just makes everyone happy.
I literally can't remember the names of these books, but there's one by Mishumi where my son and we were working through, and it is an autobiography, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of it, but it's just interesting to learn about culture of someone else and the life, which is really important to our family. And then my daughter and I were reading it's a nonfiction book by a mother and a daughter. And again, my brain is just flatlined, and it's Brave, or I can't remember, but I love the book, and just getting to hear from a mom's perspective and a daughter's perspective. And clearly, we like nonfiction in our family because that's what we do. We do read a lot of nonfiction about history and culture and people and the Bible.
That's right. There's the Bible.
The Bible. The Bible. Yes, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I hope you feel inspired to read with your kids, and I hope it feels not like there's a burden that we're putting on you, but just something that you get to do and that God gives us the privilege of doing. So.